Hello and welcome to another podcast from Hotel Technology. Today we're very fortunate to be joined by Vee Mapunde. Vee is the coordinator for the NIHR Surgical MedTech Co-operative. And Vee has been in the position for a number of years, and the position's made a great deal of difference to a number of people. Hello, Vee.
Hi, Stephen. How are you doing?
It's very well. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
I was wondering if you wouldn't mind telling people about how you ended up where you are today.
Yeah, sure. It wasn't a straightforward route by any means or stretch of the imagination. I started off life doing a bachelor's in technology and management sciences at the University of Bradford. And for those that are wondering what it is, it really was a light touch engineering degree, but it was mainly on materials engineering. And the reason I chose it was I just didn't know what I wanted to do after my A-levels. So I just thought I'd take something that just seemed to combine a lot of different elements together, which is what it did. So in terms of US speak, it was a major in materials engineering, but we did study a lot about accounting, HR, logistics, and that type of thing. And then obviously when I graduated, this was a time before, even proper internet. This was the days of dial-up internet. This was the days where Sky or satellite TV was still very, very expensive. So you're just basically left with terrestrial TV stations. And it was a choice of either, watching boring daytime TV or just getting some sort of employment to keep my mind busy. So I did get a job as a research coordinator at the Sheffield Children's Hospital in their research department. And I was doing a lot of systematic reviews, and that was part-time. And round about that time, the EU Directive on Clinical Trials sort of came in when we were obviously still part of the EU. So we did that. And that role basically morphed into a clinical trials coordinator, supporting mainly industry partners get their trials run within the trust. And things just really mothballed from there. And when they did set up the NIHR, which is the National Institute for Health and Care Research, around 2005, 2006, I started getting involved in some of the work streams around that aspect. So the path into the NIHR basically was facilitated by that role, because at that point, the NIHR was very industry focused and facing, and it still is largely today. And I became an industry manager for West Yorkshire region, which was helping mainly pharmaceutical companies place their studies within the UK. And at some point back around 2015, there was the opportunity to join something that at that time was called a HTC, Health Tech Co-operative. Yes, yes. That's the acronym, yeah, Health Tech Co-operative. And that was focused on medtech. And what the NIHR acknowledged at that time was there was a lot of support for pharmaceutical companies, but there wasn't a lot of support for medtech and health tech companies. So that was the start in that. So for those that know me, when I worked in the pharmaceutical bit of the NIHR, it was one of those where medtech was completely the wild, wild west. No one wanted to touch it with a barge pole, because if you understand pharmaceutical research, it's very structured. There's lots of resources. Everybody knows what they're doing, whereas medtech is slightly different just because of how the industry itself is structured. But nevertheless, I did end up in medtech, and I sort of 7, 8 years later, I'm still here.
And you're in a very interesting division, aren't you? You're in the Surgical MedTech Co-operative. Can you tell me something about that?
Yes, so the Surgical MedTech Co-operative, basically, we've got two key functions. The first function is supporting the development. So when innovators, whether they're academic, clinical, or industry, when they come to us, they've either got a concept, that they're working through. They want to find out whether they're working along the right clinical themes, or maybe they want a prototype, or they basically could want a proof of concept in a clinical setting. That's what our main function is to provide that link into the clinical setting and get the clinical expertise. The second function that we have is generating evidence. So that might come much later on in the process. And when we talk about generating evidence, it could be things around health economics, evaluation. It could be things around having the right clinical trial methodology, for instance, because not all clinical trials apply when it comes to medtech and health tech. So that is what we do mainly across general surgery. Is our particular main focus, because we're looking at technologies that can be used across different surgical areas, not just purely focused on one. So that is what we do. And another important function as well is having that user input. So this is something that we call patient and public involvement and engagement within the NIHR. So we do a lot of medtech focus groups to support grant funding applications, for instance. So we tend to act as clinical partners for that, or user partners for sort of the main grant funding applications.
Does the NIHR fund the trials themselves, or does the partner fund the trials?
It can be either. So if the partner is in a position to fund the trials, they can do that. If they're not, the NIHR has got funding for that. Obviously, you've got to apply. It's a competitive process, but having a NIHR unit involved in that collaboration basically increases the chances of getting a trial funded, basically. So it's within any startup or SME's advantage to actually explore how the NIHR can support their particular innovation.
Right. So could you give me an example of some case studies or some recent case studies that you've been involved in?
Yeah, sure. So we've actually got one which has actually worked out brilliantly, because we've seen it grow over the span of sort of years, where initially we approached at the end of 2017 by a company. They had a concept for augmented reality within a surgical theater setting. And it was just really a concept. We held a medtech focus group for them with a bunch of patients and clinicians as well. And this actually helped them to reshape their concept and their idea. They came in with one version of what they thought they wanted. But after they had these focus groups, it actually transpired that what the NHS would actually want from this technology, which is really about preventing what's called never events in the NHS. So for those that aren't familiar, a never event is something that really should not happen. So for instance, a patient dying because there was just no processes in place for something. So an example of a never event, for example, is a scalpel being left in somebody's abdomen following an operation. You don't want that. So that's what this technology really was about. It was about the patient safety aspect of it. So once they formulated that plan, we helped them with a grant funding application to Innovate UK, which is one of the major health tech funders in the United Kingdom. They were able to secure just under £1 million for that. And that then helped them develop that concept further. And together with our host organization, which is Leeds Teaching Hospitals, they were able to secure theatre space to actually continually test this particular technology and innovation with the support of real staff. And when I say real, it's people who actually understand the processes. So they had to simulate an operation. And we went through various iterations of these. We got a second round of funding as well, just over £2 million, to continue with more of the evaluations, get the health economics in, to support business cases for the NHS trusts further down the line. And we are now at a point where we are actually finalizing sort of the results of the last evaluation that they did. And hopefully it should sort of showcase, it should demonstrate that it's been health economics wise, it's viable. And actually in terms of patient safety outcomes, it's going to be of tremendous benefit to patients. And that means they'll then be in a position to actually then get this adopted into the NHS. So we'll then be able to hand them over to another part of the NIHR, or the Health Innovation Networks, as they're called in England. And they'll be then able to support them with the adoption. So that's one particular example of one that's gone through the entire, from idea to very close to commercialization.
It's a wonderful example. Thank you for that. Tell me, the NIHR, do you work closely with NICE?
When we say we work closely, we don't really have very close workings with them. Well, what we do have is we have individuals that understand the processes within NICE. We have individuals that understand what NICE wants to see. So NICE are very much aware of the NIHR, and they will call on our support as and when is required. So NICE have got an assessment service now. The name sort of skips my mind now, but they've got a service where companies can actually come in and submit the information they have. And what NICE will do is actually identify the gaps, and where the gaps require the NIHR, then they will forward them onto NICE. Tend to come more into contact with NICE for things that involve sort of the large scale cost benefit, cost effectiveness clinical trials, because then those have got to be designed with the approval processes in mind. So it tends to come further down the line rather than quite early on.
Okay. With the Surgical MedTech Co-operative, are you looking at any AI software applications at all?
Yes, so artificial intelligence definitely comes into that. But the key thing with artificial intelligence, so what we have found is there's lots of things that are badged as AI, for instance, but they're not really AI. It's just pure pattern recognition, which I understand is an element of AI. However, from a healthcare professional and patient outcome perspective, what people are looking for, what the NHS is looking for, is something that goes beyond the pattern recognition. So we are looking at something where if it identifies a pattern, it should then be able to suggest or recommend, the next best pathway for you to go to. So I'll give an example with one of the areas where we're seeing a lot of this artificial intelligence. So there's two main areas. You've got artificial intelligence mainly for image recognition. That is where we're seeing the bulk of it. And if you look at diabetic foot ulcers, for instance, those come through under surgery. And they come through under surgery because of diabetic foot ulcers. If you don't get them under control, that leads to amputations. And amputations automatically reduce the lifespan of an individual. So actually, you don't want to reduce the lifespan. You want to give somebody an increased lifespan and quality of life. So for diabetic foot ulcers, it's very important to monitor the progression of the ulcer. Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Is it staying the same? Because that influences treatment outcomes. And we've got a lot of AI-related innovations coming in that can monitor whether something's getting worse or whether something's getting better. But for the ones that are getting worse, actually, we want AI to tell us that based on all these use cases and things it's analyzed, the best course of treatment for this particular individual would be to explore these particular treatment outcomes. So that is what the clinicians are looking for within AI. Is pattern recognition by itself is not enough to justify interest in that. We need to take it beyond that. So what we tend to provide is that direction for AI innovators to say, well, that's brilliant, but this is what we want to work on. We need this AI to tell us X, Y, Z. If you're able to do that, it then eases the adoption and commercialization route, whether it's the NHS or another healthcare system that they're looking at.
Okay, perfect. I wasn't aware of that. Tell me, you mentioned Leeds Hospital. You've obviously got a very strong association with Leeds Hospital. How does that work?
That's a very good question, actually. So the way it works basically stems from how the Department of Health and Social Care works. So we are funded by the Department of Health and Social Care, and Department of Health and Social Care is most commonly associated with the NHS. So the NHS is the big thing that they look after. Now, they can only make those payments to organizations they've got a legal contract with. So the NIHR itself is a virtual organization. So it does not have any legal, it's not a legal entity. So it's got to legalize itself through the mechanisms that exist. And for the Department of Health, those mechanisms are NHS trusts. So the money can only flow for us from Department of Health to NHS trusts. So every 5 years, we are funded in 5-year cycles. Every 5 years, what the Department of Health does is it invites every single NHS trust to apply to host one of these infrastructure units, as they're called. And you've got to demonstrate that you've got enough clinical and academic expertise, amongst other things, to the Department of Health. Leeds Teaching Hospitals tends to have a very strong track record for surgical technologies and medtech related activities. So naturally, we are going to apply in the area that we've got our strengths in.
Okay, so Leeds Teaching Hospital is a large establishment. Can you tell me something about?
Yeah, so Professor David Jane is the clinical director for the Surgical MedTech Co-operative. He's a colorectal surgeon, by background. He's also an academic surgeon as well. So he does have teaching responsibilities. with the University of Leeds. So we do work with quite a few sort of leading surgeons. I know every hospital has got its own. We're not saying ours are necessarily the best, but what we do have is a lot of research and medtech focused surgeons, particularly for the surgical areas. So for instance, within liver, we've got a big transplant. Leeds has got a huge transplant surgery offering. So we do a lot of transplants there, particularly we don't cover it, but you've got the hand transplants, for example. And I think a couple of years back, I think it was Professor Simon Kay.
Yes.
They did a transplant. They tested a limb transplant, and they've got successful transplants as well in human beings. But I think they did one on a tiger or something, as a proof of concept type thing. So Leeds tends to be associated with a whole lot of interesting surgical innovations, and we tend to be at the forefront of that. But we also work closely with other surgeons in other areas. So we're not restricted to working with people in Leeds. Our remit is national, international facing. So we don't just work with people in Leeds, we work with everybody.
And you've also got engineering leads, nanotechnology leads. I think you've got pathology leads that are all tied up to surgery. You've got quite a host of interesting people.
Yes, and that is where the University of Leeds element comes in, so each hospital that hosts any of these NIHR things has to work with a university, they provide the academic support that sometimes can be lacking for startups and SMEs. So nanotechnology, for instance, is quite big for surgery because we're looking at miniaturized robots, for example, so robots that can crawl inside arteries, for instance, and fix things. There's those kinds of developments along the way. You've got, robots. I think some people might be familiar with the pills that you swallow that then take images and videos of your intestines as a diagnostic mechanism, because the current ways of diagnosing certain intestinal conditions are quite invasive. So our focus is just minimally invasive therapies, basically. Mechanical engineering comes in because surgery is often associated with hardware. So it's about understanding the right materials actually to use for that hardware. We're starting to look at sustainability, for instance. I think from the end of 2025, any sort of med tech that needs to go through the NHS, companies are going to need to submit something called a carbon reduction plan. So it's looking at the sustainability of the materials that are used to start off with. It's about moving away from single-use devices to actually how do we get back to the days when we used to sterilize and decontaminate devices. So mechanical engineering is very helpful in that. Pathology actually is quite an interesting one because it's about the diagnostic element of it. So diagnosis tends to take a long time. And what tends to happen in most hospitals is when a patient's on the operating table, they usually cut off, a bit of the tissue to make sure they've removed enough of the cancer, for instance. And that has to go to the pathology labs, but that can mean 45 minutes to an hour wait, but the patient is still on the operating table whilst we're waiting because they can't close the patient up until they know what it is that they've got. So it's about reducing actually that timeline in terms of that diagnostic element. So we're also looking at technologies for that. And pathologies, they've got a high workload. So it's about increasing the capacity for them to actually do more activities, but also diagnose people quicker. So all these academic elements we have are very complementary to the surgical offering. So it's not purely just about developing the device, but making sure it's got the right thinking and the right evidence behind it.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, I think if someone was interested in approaching your organization, they go through yourself. And how often do you review applications? How often do you get to go? I know you meet biannually as a team, but how often do you review applications? Daily, weekly?
So we tend to review applications monthly. Obviously, when it comes to summer, July, August, the gap's slightly longer because people generally aren't around, but we tend to do that monthly. But if people were interested, I'm initially the first port of call.
Yes.
What I initially do is really screen that, because what we also get is a lot of people who think we're backdoor into the NHS, and no, we're not. So if you've got technology that's ready and you've already got it marketed and used in other countries or even in other NHS sites, we really can't help you. You know, the horse is already bolted, so to speak. So that's my job, is to filter that. And sometimes it just might not be the right surgical area, but I might be able to signpost to other areas, either within our host organization, the Leeds Teaching Hospitals NHS Trust, or I can signpost to other areas of the NIHR, because the NIHR covers a wide range of clinical areas. So I'm more likely to know the right people to send you to, rather than you trying to go on Google, for instance, and work it out yourself.
And I want to let the audience know that that's absolutely the truth. Vee has been I have passed on a number of people to Vee, and she has directed them right throughout the NHS. What else is it that you'd like to talk about the organisation?
So I think one of the key things actually to mention is what the future looks like for the organization. Because I mentioned we're funded on 5-year cycles. We're coming to the end of a 5-year cycle on the 31st of March. The Surgical MedTech Co-operative ends. And then we turn into something called a Health Tech Research Center. So another acronym, an HRC, in Accelerated Surgical Care. So that's going to start on the 1st of April, 2024. And that 5-year cycle will complete on the 31st of March, 2029. So we've got a good 5 years ahead of us. But I think in terms of the main difference and where the excitement possibly could be is our change in, well, I'd say an expansion of focus, and also slight change in remit, where it's also going to widen it. So we're still NIHR, we're still based at the Leeds Teaching Hospital, still supported by the University of Leeds, and all the services I described are still going to apply. But in terms of remit, what we're going to do is, instead of focusing on acute or secondary care, which is what we're typically associated with at the moment, is we're going to operate across the entire surgical pathway. So we're going to start looking at diagnostics that can be used in primary care for surgery. So they're mainly focused on sepsis, diagnostics for transplantation, infection. So it's things that can impact on surgery, basically. So we're going to be looking at in vitro diagnostics. We're going to maintain our focus, obviously, on acute care, which will mainly be around digital technologies and still more of the minimally invasive therapies. Obviously, your robotics will come in there in some way, shape, or form. And we are also going to look at, once the patients have the surgery in the hospital, how do we discharge them safely into a community or social care setting? So we are also going to be working within that community and social care setting to see what technologies can be. So mainly along the lines of remote sensing technologies and wearables, how can we implement those effectively and develop them effectively for that particular setting?
Fantastic. So will you be maintaining your own registry? How will you be doing this?
So we've got some industry partners that we're working with. So for the HRC, as it will be known, because the remit's been widened and a bit more funding has been provided, we are actually currently working with an industry partner that's going to help us develop this registry. And that's going to help us pull everything together, because as you can imagine, we're just going to sort of attract everything and everything. You know, in terms of our clinical remit as well, we are going to include transplantation surgery, which is something we didn't have. We're also going to have emergency general surgery, and we've added orthopedics to that as well. So all those elements are just going to mean a whole lot of companies and innovations coming to us wanting that. So we definitely need to have some sort of registry. We also have advantages in that, particularly for community, within Leeds, there's something called the niche network. So that's NICHE. And that is basically a network of care homes that operates across the Leeds city region. And their purpose basically is to facilitate this adoption of innovation and sort of generating this evidence for innovation within their particular setting. So we're in a very good place to be able to see how an innovation can move from the beginning all the way to the end, instead of just being focused on a narrow part of that pathway. One of the other things will also, the added remit as well, will be there's 3 main elements to it. The first being regulatory expertise, which sounds a bit weird because you don't associate the NHS with regulatory expertise. It's not the area, mainly because it's just not what they're funded to do. But I think it's more to do with filling in the gaps that Brexit's left, and obviously the changes within the regulatory framework. We've got market access as a remit as well. So how do we help people design a concept with market access in mind?
I think that's a wonderful idea. Yep.
Concept, yeah. And then the final element of that is capacity building, training and capacity building. So how do we train all our stakeholders in how to actually navigate the medtech, health tech pathway more efficiently, basically? So instead of people just getting lost somewhere in the system, how do we more or less empower them to actually have that information that they need? So we still don't have the details of how that will work, because it's something that we are going to be doing in the next couple of weeks with our stakeholders and our partners. But I think that means we'll be able to give a more complete service for the medtech and health tech innovation pathway.
That was a fantastic summation. I really enjoyed talking to you today. I'm very pleased you had the opportunity to give me your time. Thank you very much, Vee. I wish you all the very best in the future. I hope to talk to you again in about 6 months' time to see how the change of name is coming along, and not to mention the change of objective. But I mean, I know for a fact that yourself and your organisation has made a large impact already on the outcomes of millions of human beings in the UK. So I want to thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity. It's been brilliant talking to you.